Hello and welcome to the Yo Soy Pachuanista YouTube channel. I am Katie Catita, and today I have Jessica Ash with us of Jessica Ash Wellness. Jessica is an icon in the female health space. I so appreciate your work. I'm so excited to have the chance to share your work with my audience and with the Spanish-speaking world, because something I just mentioned to you is this kind of pro-metabolic, bioenergetic, nutrition perspectives, and we can talk about what that means today. But those kind of perspectives are fairly new to the health space in Latin America. Right now, a lot of people are into keto and low carb and probably intermittent fasting. So those are topics that we're also going to discuss today. So before we dive into female physiology and optimal nutrition for supporting women, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience and talk a little bit about how you became the woman that you are, teaching what you teach about women's health.
Mm, Thank you so much for having me, Katie. I'm so honored to be here. I, I always kind of start it with, I think a lot of us come to the health and wellness world for the same reason, which is that we're really suffering. We're struggling, our health is suffering, whether it be our quality of life or we have real diagnosed health issues. Maybe it's just kind of like a myriad of symptoms. Gut issues, hormonal issues, or just as simple as like, I want to lose weight and keep it off, which is totally valid. For me, I had kind of a rocky, rough time at a very young age. I was pretty poor health growing up, just digestive issues, hormonal symptoms. I was always kind of puffy, a little bit overweight. And when I went through puberty, it just, the issues just kind of went out of control, escalated out of control. And of course, going to the doctor, what did they do? They just prescribed me hormonal birth control, and I was put on at 14, 15. I was on it for a few years. I think just being so young, I just thought like, why am I on this anymore? I think I'm going to go off. I don't want to be on this anymore. And my health issues escalated exponentially. It was almost like the band-aid had been taken off, and I immediately started struggling with all types of autoimmune issues, achy joints, rapid weight gain. My hair started falling out quite quickly. Typical thyroid symptoms, cold all the time, can't lose weight. And this was all happening at the time of, the transition from high school to college. So I was just so overwhelmed with everything in life. And instead of being like, this is the start of my life, I have to actually like lay in bed most of the time. I was very ill. I ended up getting different diagnoses from different people, but it was along the lines of PCOS, had a lot of the typical PCOS symptoms, and then autoimmune conditions like Hashimoto's and lupus were put in there as well. Um, but I never really cared about the labels. I just wanted answers. And I pretty quickly realized that unless I wanted to go on medication for the rest of my life, there was not a lot of answers, unless I was going to seek them out myself. And that really started my journey. And just like anyone else, you kind of start to experiment, you just learn and you experiment as you go. And I kind of jumped into the world of veganism first. So did like raw, like a raw vegan diet, vegan, kind of gluten-free, dairy-free. And then that quickly did not work for me. And so I morphed more towards the paleo and primal side. I was paleo for a good amount of time, but even though a lot of my symptoms did resolve, right? Because anytime we move from a diet that is full of seed oils and refined carbohydrates and not very nutrient dense, pretty much. I wasn't eating for nutrient density. I was just eating for keeping calories as low as possible. You do feel better because you're changing your gut microbiome. You're changing, you're getting nutrients in. But I kept chasing those symptoms, and I had to get stricter and stricter because those were the answers that were offered to me, right? It's the carbohydrates that are the problem. It's the dairy that's the problem. It's the coffee that's the problem. It's the gluten that's the problem. It's the sugar that's the problem. And so eventually I kind of morphed from paleo to low carb paleo, then to keto, and then all the way to like a primal keto, and then all the way to carnivore. And after carnivore, I was kind of like, where do I go from here? I keep getting stricter and stricter and stricter, and yet nothing is, the symptoms kind of felt like I was playing like a whack-a-mole, where it was like one symptom would pop up, I would hit that down, and the other one would pop up, and I'd hit that down, and I didn't know where to go. I couldn't get any more restricted, and restriction was always the only thing offered as the answer. And so that is when I found I actually found the work of Dr. Ray Peat, who's kind of a popular cornerstone of this bioenergetic point of view, or this pro-metabolic point of view. And kind of my eyes started to open. I started to realize that, oh, it's very possible that my cells are not getting what they need, and they weren't functioning appropriately in the first place. And that is why I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling. And I'm actually going to have to do some really hard work to restore that and heal that, rather than just kind of cater to this body that's already cutting corners. And we can definitely dive into that. But that's what kind of led me here. I have a very large passion for studying female physiology specifically, and understanding how female bodies work, because they are very unique and different. And a lot of the nutrition research that's out there today is mainly focused on male physiology and male bodies, which a lot of the nutrition studies out there, if they're done on humans, which most of them are not, but if they are done on humans, most of them are done on men, and men don't have a cycle like we do. And so our hormones fluctuate from day to day to day, at least for cycling women, which means that our metabolism shift from day to day to day. And we have just different needs and different types of resilience to stress. So our resilience to stress is different. It's not less, it's different. So I'm sure we can dive into all of that.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. Your path, the path of restriction, and then arriving to this place where I just can't restrict anymore, I think is the path of so many people. And it's so interesting when I get emails from people that are like, I've done this protocol, I've done this thing, I've done all this, and I'm like, maybe what you need to do is eat an ice cream and walk in the park and call your friend, or go have a glass of wine, like what if the answer was so much more easeful and beautiful and peaceful and pleasurable than we could ever have imagined, like,
Yeah.
but also I totally honor the path, like, all the things that we have to go through to get to the point. I honor the path of restriction, because for many of us, it's literally the only way we could arrive to that which is not restriction,
Agreed. I love that you bring that up, because it's like you have to live under this restriction, or this, I almost feel like it's a law. Like you have all these laws you have to follow, all these guidelines you have to follow. You have to learn to live under the law and realize, like, wow, this is just suffocating me. I cannot live here. Like this is not life. You get to a point where you're just like worried about every little thing that you're going to eat, and you're thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm about to go out to a restaurant with friends. Like, what am I going to eat? And it's just, you get to a point where it's like, is this really even living anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to start. Okay. So many of us are undernourished. We have like transgenerational malnutrition, because, the last several generations we've eaten processed food, and we see the degeneration in our health over several generations. So many of us are probably starting, our baseline is not what it used to be 100 or 200 years ago. We're starting already from a really undernourished place. And then most women are not eating enough food. I guess we would start there. And I can offer just a little anecdote. You said something once to me. I'm not to me. You said it on a video. You basically said it's me.
That's
You
you.
you said like it's something like it's better just to eat and not wait to eat until it's perfect. And I don't know, and that's obvious now, but for some reason, like it didn't click until I heard you say it because I used to, I mean, for years I would be like, yeah, well, the meat's not grass fed. I'd rather just skip a meal than eat like, factory farm meat or something. Like, so I would skip a lot of meals and then it just clicked like, whoa, wait a minute. Like you can eat and it's better to eat than not to eat, no matter what the quality of the food is. So maybe we'll take it there because I realize I just talked a lot, but that kind of this idea that we're not eating enough. Many people would say, yes, we are. What are you talking about? So
Right.
maybe we'll go there.
Yeah, yeah. So I think like the common belief system that you see, especially in the very like functional health space, a lot of the low carb, keto, like that carnivore space is it's this idea that like people are overeating. Like we're just overeaters. We're just sitting there like binging on food constantly. We're sugar addicts. Like we just can't control ourselves. Like we're just like given over to this like I don't know. Like we just can't control ourselves. We're animals. And our body wants us to be fat. And it's like when you have that mindset, and you have that mentality that your body is against you, you're going to constantly feel like you have to manipulate it, or you have this like transactional relationship with it, or almost that you have to be like, I gotta control you, like you're not for me, you're against me. And there's this inner war, this inner battle that begins. And I think a lot of people are living this battle without even recognizing it, where it's like my body appetite is bad. There's like that overarching idea that like, oh, I started to eat this diet and my appetite went away. So therefore it's good. And so many women, something that I noticed, and this is not something I just recently noticed in history, there are scientists and doctors that I have studied that started to notice this in the early 1940s and 50s with like the typical 50s housewife, where she would skip meals, just taking care of the kids, whatever, like doing, going to work, just not eating until dinner time, or like sipping on a Coca-Cola, drinking a coffee, maybe having a snack here and there. But at the end of the day, that's when she would have her dinner. And starting to recognize that this was leading to specifically hormonal conditions like premenstrual syndrome, or all types of ovulation issues, low progesterone. And so the undernourished woman, this idea of like being undernourished, is this idea that what if the reason that you feel like you can't control yourself around food or certain foods, right? Calorically rich, sugary foods, which are in a way fuel, they still are fuel, is because you are not consistently nourishing yourself on a regular basis. You're not waking up and eating consistently. Most people that are struggling with their weight or struggling with their metabolism have never actually eaten consistently in their life. They've never woken up, eaten breakfast around the same time every day, eaten a snack when they get hungry, eaten lunch, just had like a rhythm or a frequency of food consumption that works for their bodies. It's always kind of been an afterthought, or this thing of like, I'm going to put it off for as long as possible. Or like you said, I'm going to only wait until the best of the best is available to me. And I'd rather fast or not eat than eat something that's imperfect. Most of us live our life that way, or, we'll wake up, drink coffee. And like you said, this is a generational issue. It's not just our generation, but we have a choice to make. We can keep doing what our mothers did and our grandmothers did, or we can do something a little bit different and go back to the old ways, or go back to this tradition of nourishment is more than just food. It's more than just fuel. It is life. You are nourishing your life. You're nourishing your blood. You're nourishing your light in a way. And if you are undernourished or you're not nourished, you're going to see signs of that fire or that light diminishing. You're going to see things like low libido. You're going to see things like your moods. You can't stabilize your moods. You're never happy. You're not able to ever see the glass half full because the glass is empty, right? You're empty. You might have headaches, which are oftentimes driven by blood sugar issues. You might have detoxification issues. The liver needs fuel. You might have gut issues because you're constantly hopping into fight or flight. And I guess we could get into that in a moment. Our body doesn't run on thin air. And so if we do not eat the fuel that we need, we have to make the fuel that we need. And that process comes at a cost.
Right. The body needs fuel no matter what. If you don't eat, your body will break itself down to eat. And that's,
Exactly.
yeah. So that
Exactly.
gets into muscle issues and I mean, and your organs shrink, that I think that
Right.
your organs can shrink, the size of them.
Exactly. And the process, gluconeogenesis, that actually is you taking your muscle tissue, breaking it down, sending it to the liver to turn it into sugar, because the belief system now is that your body can manufacture its own sugar. No need to eat any carbohydrates, no need to eat any sugar. They're non-essential. Your body will make the carbohydrates it needs. Well, that is true. Because if you didn't do that, you would die. Your brain and your nervous system do contrary to popular belief, does not run on fat. Some parts of your brain, the survival parts of your brain, can run on both glucose and fat as a survival mechanism. This is why you often see that when you go into like something like ketosis, if you've ever been in ketosis or low carb, there's that initial kind of low carb flu that's very popular where you feel like absolute trash. And people say, oh, it's just your need for electrolytes. The reason for that is because when you are running on adrenaline, adrenaline acts like a diuretic. And so in order to turn muscle into carbs or sugar, really it's glucose, you have to initiate a few processes, and that includes your adrenal glands. So your adrenal glands have to start pumping out adrenaline, and then your pancreas will secrete a blood sugar raising hormone called glucagon, and then that will start to break down your muscle tissue, send it to the liver. The liver has to focus everything it has, instead of doing its 500 other jobs over here, it has to start converting protein into glucose so that your brain can fire and fuel itself. And oftentimes it'll only create what is absolutely essential because it's a very harsh process. And so a lot of people, when they're in like something like low carb or keto specifically, they will feel like they're very mentally clear at first. Like they're very like on it. They have so much energy, they can focus on anything. But if they look what's beneath the surface of that, oftentimes there's a lot of urgency. So there's this underlying energy of survival when you're in this metabolic state. And the reason is because you're having to move into the sympathetic nervous system state, or that fight or flight state, in order to sustain this process long term. And so with that mental clarity and with that energy, it comes at a cost, and underlying that there's usually a little bit of snappiness. There's this kind of feeling of who's watching me or who's looking at me. There's kind of this almost like underlying, you're always scanning for the negative because you are in a survival state, and you can only sustain it so long. And eventually, and you see this pattern happen a lot, is eventually people feel like it's not working any longer. So what do they have to do? Well, they have to get stricter, right? Carbs have to go down a little bit more. We have to cut more things out. Maybe it's the stevia, maybe it's the salt, maybe it's the this, maybe it's the that. And it's because you can only sustain this for so long and feel good. Eventually, you're going to burn through your resources, and then you're not going to have any resources to spare. And your body's going to start to ask you to replenish those resources so it can restore normal metabolic function. So these very popular right now approaches could maybe be therapeutic in the short term for some individuals, but long term, it's not usually sustainable for the system. In actuality, most women have to do some type of healing to get themselves out of this nervous system state that they've kind of put themselves in. It's survival based eating, I guess we could call it.
Yeah, and okay, so I share my story because I think it's the story of so many modern women that I really have, I've really understood that I was in a survival mode since the womb. My mama was definitely undernourished, very thin, undernourished, lots of cortisol, lower progesterone, lower thyroid from the womb, from the get-go. And so I lived most of my life very allegiant to that hormonal blueprint of survival that I was first exposed to. Even when I was super into nutrient-dense foods and Weston A. Price and all this stuff, and I was eating good foods, but I wasn't eating enough of them.
Mm.
And it was really only, I'm about to be 36. It was when I turned 34, things totally changed. I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot get away with living my life as though everything was an emergency. And I really, yeah, for different women, it happens at different ages. But for me, it was 34. It was like, you cannot do this. You cannot. You either are going to die or you're going to have to change your ways. You're going to have to move a little bit closer to security in all the ways,
Yes. Yeah, I love how you describe that, like allegiant to that hormonal state of stress, because if that's your normal state, it feels good. Like it feels normal. It just feels normal, and anything other than that feels unsafe. So I can see why so many of us are in that state. I have a similar story to you, as like my mother as well, like was just undernourished, didn't know any better, undernourished, very thin, very lean, even during pregnancy. And I think I came out of the womb like hungry. That's what I always like joke about, is like I came out of the womb like when I was a kid, I was like the butter on the counter, like I'm sticking my fingers and just like eating butter, like my body was like, you need help. You need to nourish
You
at
need
whatever
butter.
cost. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think a lot of us have come out of the womb pretty hungry.
Uh-huh. So, okay. So, do you have a different approach for women who are underweight versus overweight? I don't, what are your thoughts on like a woman, wants to optimize their metabolism? What are your approaches with a woman who is underweight versus someone who legitimately actually could lose some pounds and that would contribute to her health?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it just depends on the woman. There's nuance there, right? I think in typically, unfortunately, the way that social media works is we have this very generalized information out there right now, especially when it comes to the pro-metabolic approach, where it's just like eat every 2 to 3 hours, always eat protein, carb, and fat, never eat vegetables. It's just everyone's like has this very like cookie cutter approach. But I think it is important to look at the nuance of the situation. So if a woman is overweight, let's say, I don't know, 20, 30 pounds, she has to lose. Her eating every 2 to 3 hours may not actually make her feel good. But if she is someone that is running on stress, very high stress lifestyle, or maybe high stress internal world, we could say, like maybe externally not a lot of stress, but internally a lot of stress, and has always undereat or eaten very inconsistently, it you have to kind of put it into perspective. So like if they have not eaten 3 meals a day ever in their life, that's some women that I meet, sometimes it's just enough to just like, let's focus on getting really nourishing breakfast, lunches, and dinners, and making these really full and nourishing. And then for some women, they do really well with that kind of eating a little bit smaller portions every couple of hours. So again, it just kind of is dependent on the woman. I think some of the biggest mistakes, if you are already overweight, the goal is not to gain more weight, because we don't necessarily want to be that uncomfortable. We don't necessarily want to add more fat on the body to cause inflammation and these hormonal imbalances that come from having too much excessive fat. There's, fat at the end of the day, I know there's a lot of stigma around it, but fat cells simply expand to store fuel. And so if we are somebody that easily puts our fuel into storage, it usually means one of two things: is we're either not using fuel efficiently at all, and that's where we have to ask ourselves what's going on. Is there a thyroid issue there? Is there estrogen exposure there? Is there a lot of adrenaline and cortisol there? Those can all kind of shunt your fuel into fat. Another thing is what are our exposures? If we're continuously being exposed to a lot of xenoestrogens in our environment, we're going to start to push all of that into the fat cells, and they're going to expand, 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 expand. So I think it's a nuanced approach, but no matter what your weight is, no matter if you're overweight or underweight, you need to eat, and you need to eat consistently, and you deserve to eat. It's not like I'm going to just try to eat as little as possible until I can get down to my goal weight. How's that working out for you? It's not, I promise. So it's really about prioritizing protein, definitely making protein the center of your meals, finding the amount of fat that works well for you. Also finding the carbohydrates that work well for you. Carbohydrates are not bad. In fact, I've actually seen a lot of women who were on lower carb diets, had a hard time losing weight. At first, they could lose weight, but then they stopped being able to lose weight and actually gained it all back. Had to implement some carbohydrates because we need carbohydrates for thyroid function. Everyone's different, but we do need them to convert our T4, which is that inactive thyroid hormone that the thyroid makes, into T3. And so for some of us, having some carbohydrates in the diet actually reduces stress on the body and increases our energy production. So our caloric burn increases. So really, if there's is there a different protocol? Yeah, I think somebody that's underweight is going to maybe get away with those more fattening foods, I guess I could say, which is more calorically dense that contain both tons of sugars and fats. I don't know, whole milk would be a great example of that. It's just somebody that's underweight could probably handle a lot more whole milk than someone that's overweight. And that's just simply that calories are being utilized a little bit differently. But the stressors are usually very similar that are driving both. It's just kind of how they're manifested in the body. I guess we could put it that way.
Mm-hmm. So touching on you mentioned thyroid issues, and when someone reads the book of Dr. Broda Barnes, you come to the conclusion that everyone has a thyroid issue.
Yes.
And then you start, testing your basal body temperature, and you're like, wow, everyone really does have a thyroid issue. And then you go into the rabbit hole of well, should I be taking thyroid medicine? And if so, what kind of thyroid medicine? And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that, on thyroid medication. And then also, what's interesting about Dr. Berta Barnes's book? I mean, maybe I didn't read it thoroughly enough, but it seems as though he doesn't say anything about food. Right? He just is talking about giving thyroid medicine, and then the issue is resolved. So
yeah,
I wonder if, and so many women are on thyroid medicine. I guess Synthroid is the second most prescribed drug in the US. So what is going on? Do you, that would be my question.
Yeah, there's something going on with obviously our core body temperatures are lowering overall. And I think, being diagnosed as hypothyroidism or hypothyroid is really interesting because when you are showing the thing that you could take, I'll rewind. The thing you could take away from Broda Barnes' book is how much true hypothyroidism gets overlooked if you're not just looking at symptoms like core body temperature, Achilles tendon reflex, pulse rate. His work is really interesting because it's showing that even if somebody is maybe not showing hypothyroid on a test, blatantly hypothyroid, they're still having a hard time with receiving that thyroid hormone within the peripheral tissues.
Mhm.
His work is kind of based on the work of a man named DC Jarvis, who also he classified hypothyroidism as two types, which this is not necessarily acknowledged in medicine today, but he wanted it to be. And he had this idea that hypothyroidism, there was like type 1 hypothyroidism where you actually like didn't make enough thyroid hormone, and then type 2 hypothyroidism, which was that you might be making enough thyroid hormone, but you're not converting it well and you're not receiving it within the cell well. And so there's a difference between having enough hormone in the blood, and because the blood is just a highway for hormones, and actually being able to utilize it in the cell. And the interesting thing about thyroid hormone that a lot of people don't know is that it is what allows the body to create energy. It's what allows the body to utilize carbohydrates and kind of start this process of getting the fire of metabolism burning. It every single cell is impacted by thyroid hormone. It actually really protects the integrity of the cell. And in true hypothyroidism, where we don't have enough thyroid hormone or we're not receiving thyroid hormone well, the cells become leaky almost. They leak minerals. They can't hold on to what they're supposed to do. They can't hold on to hydration, which is why you see a lot of dryness in thyroid conditions, dry hair, dry skin. It's because the hydration is actually affected, and there's a lot of fluid storing in certain areas. So that's all to say is like, what's going on? Well, we have a huge exposure to environmental pollutants, and the thyroid is very fatty tissue. It can accumulate very much so. And then also our liver is impacted by this. And one of the biggest parts of having enough T3 is having the liver convert T4 to T3. About 80% of that conversion is done in the liver. So we can, it's safe to assume that the liver's being bombarded, it's going to cause us to have slower, poorer metabolisms. The other thing is all of the unsaturated fats that we're exposed to. Before, like, our exposure was a little bit of nuts, maybe a little bit of seeds if we were eating that. Now we're having, corn oil and soybean oil and canola oil, and our exposure is so high, and there's an imbalance of saturated fats to unsaturated fats. Our exposure to just fats in general is excessive. Like because we live in a society of abundance, or most of us do, it's like everything is available pretty much right at our fingertips. We have full fat butter, we have full fat dairy, we have oils, we have huge bottles of oils, we have huge bottles of coconut oil, we have huge amounts of fat at our disposal, whereas before fat would have been used a little bit more sparingly. Our access to oils would have been a lot less. We would have used those very sparingly. They would have been very expensive, and most of our fats would have come from like things like dairy and meats. We wouldn't have had these big jugs of oil that we're exposed to. And so most of us are growing up consuming so much of this, just not recognizing it, or, it's not in our control really. And that has a huge impact on our metabolic function as well. It can definitely lower body temperature for most people, especially long-term exposure. So I think there's maybe a myriad of issues going on that's driving this, but at the end of the day, it's like most of us, our metabolisms are suffering. And then you add the stress on top of that, the fact that most of us are running off of just adrenaline and cortisol on our day-to-day basis. We're suppressing our thyroid function, because our thyroid function says, hey, we're in an emergency. There's a famine, there's a war, there's whatever. Okay, I'll conserve our energy. Like, we'll conserve everything. We'll start cutting corners. It's as simple as that. The thyroid is taking in the environment and just saying, okay, let's speed it up, slow it down.
So yeah, it definitely makes sense as a first step, or one of the first steps for so many people, is how can I have less plastic in my life? How can I stop using like perfumes that have chemicals in them? Like, like that's and like you talked about, because that does overburden the liver. And then it's interesting the fat piece that you bring up, because I do think collectively, even in Latin America too, there's a lot more awareness about soy oil and corn oil and those oils being less desirable. But it is a really good point that we fat was always so prized. Fat was always so prized and and rare-ish, like you say. Like I watched this, what's that show called? It's called Alive, or no, Alone in the
Mm,
and they are allowed to bring, like, it's a survival show, maybe I think 10 things, and the people who always win are the ones who one of their 10 things is pemmican.
mm, yeah.
That, but it's, and I watched them like use it so sparingly, because they know, oh my gosh, like this is how I'm going to survive, and it's a very precious treasure, and I must use sparingly. So it is interesting, because even those of us who move into the space of having good fats in our lives, maybe we don't need to go as high fat as some people say. And that brings us in the conversation of macronutrient ratios.
Right. Right. That is a good point. Just how fat is prized. It's not bad. It's in fact amazing. It's a survival food. And when you look at how the different macronutrients are burned within the body, burned, I don't that word, I don't really love that word, but utilized in the body, it's like, for every gram of fat, we have 9 calories. And if we look at calories as just units of fuel or energy, fat is double the 4 calories that you're going to find in a gram of protein and the 4 calories that you're going to find in carbohydrates. So when you are eating fat, it's very satiating, but eating oil to me is not very satiating, right? Like fatty foods can be satiating, but a ton of, popping a ton of coconut oil on a food doesn't necessarily make it more satiating, but it definitely makes it much more calorically dense. And fat is burned much slower when you actually look at like the protons that are produced and at that how many calories are burned or utilized, how much energy is pretty much how much energy do we utilize while utilizing that fuel. You find that fats burn at the slowest rate possible, whereas carbohydrates burn at the fastest rate possible. So they're fast, quick burners. There's a different energetic source. Protein also increases your caloric expenditure. So from a metabolic level, you use more fuel when you're consuming protein and carbohydrates than when you're consuming fats. Fats slow everything down. It's a conservation food. And this is why, and I definitely don't think that macronutrient ratios are the same all year round unless you live in a very tropical environment, because then your access to things like fruits and abundance is a little bit different than someone that's like in the northern, where there's just snow and there's very little of anything available except for meat and fat. And so we kind of have to take our temperature into account when we are choosing our macronutrient ratios, because you're not going to eat the same thing that you would eat in a tropical environment when you live in Alaska. It's just not going to work for you. But the more seasons you have, the more you kind of have to fluctuate a little bit, or you'll probably naturally fluctuate. You'll crave those like richer, warming, fattier, meaty foods in the winter, and it's conserving your energy, right? It's a time of not abundance, a time of for some areas, or in human history, it was a time of famine. And so the female body specifically wants to survive a famine, wants to actually be able to create life in a famine. And so when we take that perspective, we recognize that our body has a incentive to store up fuel at certain times, and certain foods are communications or information about what to do the time. But macronutrient ratios, if you are somebody who has only focused on eating really high fat or has eaten high fat and high carb, and you say, oh, carbs don't work for me, but in fact, you were eating lots of fat and lots of carbs, sometimes just, again, not demonizing fat. We need fat for hormonal production. We need it to feel satiated and full, but sometimes just raising the carbohydrates and lowering the fat a little bit can make all the difference in the world, but always making sure that, meals are protein centric for the most part, especially if you're someone that really does struggle with blood sugar imbalances. That's the biggest thing, is just regulating blood sugar and keeping it in balance.
Do you have a specific gram per pound of body weight of protein that you recommend? It kind of varies across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everyone's a little different. I would say it depends on the person. There are some women that I feel like really thrive on like 0.6 or 0.7. And then I've seen some women thrive all the way to 1.2 grams per pound. So it really is dependent on the person and also your activity level. I mean, that's really what should be taken into account. In a huge way when it comes to nutrition approaches. If you're someone that's very sedentary, let's say you have a sedentary job, you don't move a lot, you're not a big exerciser, you don't walk a lot, you don't have a high, mental strain is another big part of it. Like if you're someone that has a very like mentally demanding job, that's a huge calorie suck. In fact, your brain produces more fuel on a walk when you're in nature, or consumes more fuel than if you were like on a run on the treadmill. If your brain is working, it's utilizing fuel, it's utilizing calories. But if you're not somebody that's using energy very much, then you're gonna pretty much any diet that you do is gonna feel like it's always kind of missing the mark for you. It is a good idea to get the body moving. But if you're somebody that doesn't move a lot, you probably are not going to need as much carbohydrates as, let's say, somebody that is an athlete or close to being an athlete. But again, that doesn't mean that you don't need any carbohydrates, which I think is what people often think is like, well, I'm not moving, so I don't need to eat as much. And you might actually need to get your calories up to what a grown woman needs to eat, which is usually well over 2,000 calories for most women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you work with women, do you like work in chronometer and you kind of work on, do you put a calorie goal so that somebody could see? I think maybe a lot of women are like, yeah, I drink coffee at breakfast, then I have like a salad with grilled chicken at lunch, and at dinner I might like eat a piece of my kid's toast. I don't know.
Yeah.
So maybe, and oh yeah, I'm sure I'm getting like 2,000 calories. I see the cons of counting calories, but I also see the benefits, especially for someone who doesn't have any kind of ballpark idea of what 2,000 calories is, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's really the lens in which you view calories through. If you're somebody that has no idea how many calories are in your food, if you've calorie counted, you've always just kind of made sure that you're not eating too much. You want to really look at calories through the lens of, am I eating enough? And it's not just about calories themselves, it's about the macronutrients and the micronutrients. So the first step for a lot of women, and this depends on the person, like if you're somebody that just cannot handle calories, like that's fine. But this is what I call intentional eating. Intuitive eating is very popular out there right now, but unfortunately, you can't eat intuitively until you can eat intentionally and you understand what your body needs. Once you understand what your body needs and you understand how eating a certain way makes you feel, then you can be much more intuitive about it. But if you're somebody that has run off of stress hormones your whole life, you have eaten sporadically your whole life, your appetite signals are off, your hunger cues are off, how can you be intuitive with that if you don't understand your body's needs? needs. And so there is this mid step that I call, which is intentional eating. And it's about getting your appetite back. So the biggest thing we want to do is have a healthy appetite. You know, our appetite ebbs and flows, it wanes, but we shouldn't, you know, never be hungry. We shouldn't, take 7 hours in the morning. You know, we shouldn't. I hear so many women say, "Well, I don't get really hungry until like 1 or 2 p.m., so I don't eat until then." And it's like that's usually a sign that your body is already, when you wake up, utilizing those adrenal hormones. It stopped relying on you for fuel a long time ago because your habits consistently communicated that it's not going to get what it needs. And so sometimes we have to override that for a while to get back into a good, strong appetite schedule, I guess, within the circadian rhythm, and get our hunger hormones balanced, things like ghrelin and leptin. And it can take some time, especially when you have a lot of stress at play. But chronometer, I like that you brought it up, because it can be a very helpful tool to just track what you're eating. Like I usually tell women the first step I do is, for about a week or 2 weeks, just track everything that you eat. Don't change anything, don't do anything different, just track what you're eating. Like at the end of the day, just quickly kind of put in what you ate that day and just observe. Don't attach any stories. Don't immediately be like, oh my gosh, I'm not eating enough, or oh my gosh, I'm eating too much. It's just, what is your consistent routine look like? And oftentimes when women are under eating, they often have a pattern of binging, or these kind of ebbs and flows where they'll eat very little, very little, very little. And all of a sudden, like on the weekends, it's like, just eat whatever you want, or they can't help themselves. And that is not a lack of self-control or self-discipline. That is your body saving you, right? That is your body nourishing you, kind of overriding your preconceived notions about eating. But that pattern will usually, if you just eat consistently every day, will kind of even itself out. And you'll find that you're eating more consistently on a day-to-day basis. So the first step is just kind of seeing where you're at, just tracking where you're at, and just observing as kind of like a third-party observer. Once you know what your habits are and you really can see that, that's when you can start to actually make changes. Once you have the awareness, then it's like, okay, this is where I can start to make different choices. And that's where the real fun begins, is you start to say, oh, when I eat, this meal, it has 90 grams of fat. That's like all the fat that I really want to eat for the day. Maybe I can spread that out throughout the day. Or you kind of just make different choices, and you find that oftentimes your body will change very quickly. But yeah, that first step is really just tracking to see if you're eating enough, or what does your days look like, and how does that kind of even out by the end of the week?
Yes, in my case, I had to really for a while force myself to eat breakfast in order to regain my appetite. And I think
Yeah.
a lot of women are in that camp too. And I so appreciate what you said, like listening to a hormonally dysregulated body, like is way different than listening to a hormonally regulated body. Like listening to a deeply undernourished body is so different than listening to a body that is on the path to nourishment. So yeah, sometimes, like you said, it makes sense that we have to override what the groove is and like make another groove, because the body so appreciates routine. I
Yep.
mean, body so appreciates routine. And I think about this a lot. I mean, I'm someone I have moved many, many times in my life. And I think a lot of modern humans have. And I think that because it's so normal, we kind of have forgotten the impact that it has on your nervous system and your endocrine systems to move so much. It's like so important for women to roost, you know?
Yes. 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 I love that. And like, yeah, it's kind of like internal roosting is what you're doing. And I look at women's nourishment journeys similar to remothering yourself in a way. Most of us have not we never were taught or exampled what it looks like to nourish our bodies well, to have a good relationship with our body, a good relationship with our food, to just nourish for the sake of nourishment, and really uh, unattach nourishment from how we look. From a
Mm,
very young age, we have always attached how we eat with how we look. And to me, I think they should be two separate things. How we eat is a fundamental primal need. Nourishing our bodies is a fundamental primal need. And if most of us have that, what's called uh, Kelly McDaniel calls it mother hunger, which is like we are hungry for that guidance. We're hungry for that nourishment, that nurturance that we
mhm.
have to provide for ourselves. That's usually what nourishment looks like. And similar to a mother raising a baby or a child, a baby doesn't really isn't able to listen to their body or isn't able to really take care of their own needs at first. It needs to be coddled, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be nourished. And then as it grows, there's a little bit more freedom there, right? Freedom, you start to step back a little bit. And I look at the nourishment journey as a very similar process. It's almost like a remothering where we're going back to babyhood, and we've got to make sure we're eating on a schedule. And then over time, as we get into this more balanced place, we can really start to really trust and listen to our signals, because the trust goes both ways. The relationship we're in with our body is a trusting relationship. It's a relationship of signs and symptoms. We don't, our body doesn't speak English. It doesn't speak our language, doesn't speak Spanish, right? Like it speaks through signs and symptoms. And so when we start to learn that language, there's this language of trust, this dance back and forth, where then we start to actually know our needs before our body even asks, and vice versa. And the body, gently asks us, instead of saying like, raging stomachache or raging period. It's just more of like, these gentle kind of pangs that we feel. So
Mhm.
it's a process, and it can feel very overwhelming and scary at first, but it's just about taking one step at a time.
I heard Kelly Brogan say once that she started to tend to her needs as though she were a baby, like exactly what we're talking about. And then, then when we do, because if a baby says, "Rawr, I'm crying, I'm hungry," you're not like, "Oh, too bad, let's wait 2 hours." So same thing. If your body says, "Oh, I'm hungry," it's such a good exercise for women for one day to say, I'm going to tend to my body as though it were a baby.
Mm,
Like, I need to go potty. Okay, let me go potty. Not like, okay, let me do 10 things and then go potty?
exactly,
But I
exactly.
also get it. Like, for example, I understand too, sometimes we have to override. For example, I'm in this house. This is not routine. The air is blowing right on me and I'm cold. I'm just overriding my desire to escape from this air. But sometimes we got to do it. But I just thought I'd
Exactly.
mention that since I'm kind of preaching like tend to your needs, but I'm like blatantly ignoring the need. But it's okay because it's worth it.
Right, right. And I think that's where like our resilience comes in, is we get to decide, like, if does this need to be tended to right away? What are the consequences of it going to be? And then like, weigh the consequences. I think just a lot of women, like you said, don't realize what the consequence of saying, "Oh, I'll eat later," or "I'll eat when I'm done," or "I'll go to the bathroom when I'm done." Like doing that day after day after day does have consequences.
Right, exactly. It's like, yes, if your consistent pattern is to tend to yourself and every once in a while you don't, then that's okay.
Yep.
We don't want it to be the opposite. So maybe we can dive into, because you brought this up at the beginning and it's so obvious, except it's not obvious to most doctors that women and men are not the same.
Yep.
And so maybe we can speak briefly about our cycles, and especially, if we're still in our fertile years and as we approach menopause, like what it means to be a cyclical woman and what our cycle entails.
Yeah, yeah. So I think in our society, it's It's very hard to really honor and respect the cycle and like what it brings for us, because in our society we really want women to fruit on demand. We want everything to be instantaneous. We need to produce, right? It's all about production and producing and achieving. And so a woman's body, that's not how it works. There's a time for everything, right? There's a time for rest. There's a time for internal turning and turn or inside of ourselves. There's a time for this kind of, to me, it's almost like, and I know I heard that it described as this before, you can look at it as the seasons, right? So like our menstrual cycle, or the beginning of our menstrual cycle, when we begin to bleed, the bleed is really considered that winter time where we turn inward, we start to restore ourselves. It's a time of deep nourishment and restoration. And then as estrogen begins to rise after our bleed stops, then we enter the follicular phase, which is almost like spring, where it's like life and light and everything starts to pick up and warm up. And we're like, oh, we're back. We feel good. We feel amazing. And then around ovulation, as estrogen peaks, ovulation happens. And then the corpus luteum, which is the emptied egg sac, when you drop an egg or when you ovulate, the emptied egg sac becomes a temporary gland called the corpus luteum. And so during this ovulation time, you have more testosterone. And so it could be considered the summer of the cycle. It's just a time of abundance and a time of just feeling so good and so juicy, like summer fruit. And then as that corpus luteum begins to produce progesterone, you move into the luteal phase, which could be considered, kind of that mid luteal phase on. It could be considered autumn or fall, when, the leaves begin to fall and energy begins to wane. And I like to look at the cycle almost as this like full year cycle or this full cycle, because there's a time for everything. It's a reflection of the life, death, rebirth cycle, or the life really like life, waning, death, rebirth cycle for women. And it's a part of the metabolism as well. And when we shut this down, or when we just ignore it, which a lot of us do, we kind of ignore that this is going on behind the scenes. This is a rhythm or a pulse of our body. We oftentimes do ourselves harm instead of good. And this applies to nutrition. This applies to exercise, and this even applies to creative output. I think a lot of us expect to just be the same every single day, and it's near impossible for us. And then this will also apply to exercise. If we are someone that really enjoys activity, or we enjoy moving our bodies, it it's not going to look the same every day, and our output's not going to look the same every day, which is actually normal and natural. And then it also kind of spills over into nutrition. The first half of the cycle, you can look at it as the body is preparing for a possible pregnancy, and the second half of the cycle is the body thinks it could possibly be pregnant. So there's like this, like, it's almost could be considered like a pre-pregnancy prep or pre-pregnancy phase, where the body is changing the way the metabolism functions in order to nourish a possible child. And so that's where you start to see this rhythm take place. It's like there's a time for renewal, and then there's a time for nourishment. And you see this actually in a huge spike or increase in temperature mid-cycle. So any woman that practices the fertility awareness method, or who tracks her cycle or tracks her temperatures, you probably know that you get this kind of large temperature spike mid-cycle. And that has a lot to do with progesterone stimulation of the thyroid and the metabolism as a whole. So your metabolic function goes up during the second half of the cycle. And so sometimes your caloric needs go up. Can't tell you how many women I've heard say, I get so hungry during the second half of my cycle, and like all I want to do is eat chocolate or eat chips. And we often reach for these calorically dense foods when we or crave sugar when our body just simply needs more energy. So we could just add, a little bit of extra food to our meals, or we could add an extra snack in and make it balanced instead of kind of just be like, you know, resist it, and then kind of almost cater to, oh, the craving is just too much. I can't get a handle on it. Just work the craving into your daily needs. A lot of us have needs that go up about 200 to 400 calories that second half of the cycle, especially if we're active.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Progesterone, is a pro-metabolic, it's a warming hormone. So we need to potentially
Nourish.
eat more. Yeah, nourish more. Um, there, I wonder what your thoughts are on bioidentical progesterone supplementation. I wonder, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and I know I didn't answer a question on the thyroid meds before, so I'll kind of tie this in. But
Yeah, I forgot.
um, yeah, I forgot too. I'm sorry. I I think it just depends on the person. You have to decipher if something is a true deficiency, right? Very rarely is it that we have like an exogenous hormone deficiency. And so what is the driving factor? For some women, somebody that, let's say, is very stressed out, is very deficient in certain nutrients, doesn't get a lot of selenium in their diet, doesn't get a lot of iodine in their diet, doesn't get out in the sun. Like, it's very clear that, okay, supplementing progesterone could be like a quick fix or a band-aid. It may make someone feel better, but is it possible that they're not making progesterone because they're not getting out in the sun? Or is it possible that it's because they have low thyroid function? So I think it's just a nuanced approach. For some women, they have such severe anxiety. I would say, progesterone deficiency, if you've ever experienced it, which a lot of women have, the best way I could describe it, especially it usually manifests itself in the second half of the cycle, although um, it can manifest itself as just estrogen dominance overall, these estrogen dominant symptoms like overarching, painful ovulations, a lot of symptoms during the luteal phase. But specifically, what you often feel is almost this internal angst or this internal tension that you just can't put a finger on. There's maybe like an underlying feeling of rage involved there, but it's almost just this underlying of like if clenched hands or a clenched jaw were a feeling, that's often what low progesterone feels like. It feels like an inability to control oneself, and to relax into life. That's truly what it is, right? If you look at progesterone as the hormone of consciousness, where estrogen is the hormone of growth and cellular proliferation, draws water into the cells and drives growth, but it's not conscious growth. It just grows anything, right? It just grow, like cellular proliferation. When progesterone comes in and acts upon the growth, it adds consciousness to the growth. It adds almost like tonifying. Like in the uterus, for example, estrogen will drive that uterine tissue to grow, that endometrial lining to grow. But progesterone will come in and actually turn the stromal cells from these rod-shaped cells into these spiral-shaped cells and actually tonify it and thin it out and give it the tone that it needs. And so if we think of progesterone as doing that on many different layers throughout our body, our cells, our metabolism, for some women who are so deficient in it, who haven't experienced it in a very long time, who've maybe had anovulatory cycles for a long period of time, or some type of external source that has caused them to not ovulate or not make enough progesterone when they ovulate, bioidentical progesterone can sometimes be very almost life-changing for a woman like that. But is it necessary in all cases just because progesterone is low? Not usually. A lot of cycling women can restore progesterone function to very robust levels as long as they're nourishing. And for some women, as long as they're willing to have the proper body fat percentage. A lot of women want to remain very, very lean, and that can actually impact our progesterone levels quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the conversation around progesterone and estrogen is so fascinating because mainstream medicine still um, is always talking about the virtues of estrogen. I
Yeah.
listened yesterday to a Huberman Lab podcast that just came out a few days ago about menopause, and the board certified physician woman was on there just talking didn't I mean I'm not all the way through of the very long podcast, but hasn't mentioned progesterone at all and talk
What?
I know. And she's just talking about estrogen and with hormone replacement therapy in specific in relationship to, menopausal symptoms being caused by lack of estrogen. Like everything is lack of estrogen. And most of the older women I know, including my mom, they take they take estrogen. Now, also progesterone as well, or progestin, which is synthetic progesterone, which is different. But it's just fascinating, right? This conversation because the kind of Reiki pro-metabolic people are bestowing the virtues of progesterone, and the mainstream medicine still seems to really kind of disregard progesterone. And if they talk about it at all, it's really progestin, and
Yeah.
they're talking about estrogen. I mean, from what I've read from Ray Pete, he wouldn't recommend even a menopausal woman be taking estrogen.
Yeah, well, he describes how estrogen, with at least during perimenopause and those first couple years of menopause, is that medicine does not really um acknowledge that estrogen can be tissue bound. So that's something that's not really widely accepted, is that estrogen in the blood is like end all be all. If you don't have any estrogen in your bloodstream, then you're blatantly deficient. Now, some people can definitely be deficient in estrogen. I will never like disagree with that. But to say that every single woman on the planet, after a certain age is deficient, it to me it like screams a cult, it screams something. And so what he talks about is how when there's changes to thyroid function and there's changes to progesterone levels, what really begins to happen during perimenopause, women often will ovulate less. So they start to skip ovulations, which means they're making less progesterone overall. Now, progesterone and estrogen work together synonymously. They really shouldn't even be looked at separately. They should be looked at in tandem with one another or within ratio of one another. And you can be low in estrogen and even lower in progesterone, and that would still be considered an estrogen dominance because your estrogen is dominating over your progesterone. It's this lack of recognizing that they work together. Estrogen brushes off progesterone's receptors and progesterone brushes off estrogen's receptors. So they work together. And unfortunately, when you are only making estrogen and you're not making progesterone, you start to accumulate it in your tissues. And so when you start to skip ovulations, skip ovulations, skip ovulations, the estrogen can start to accumulate. And so he would mention how studies show that women who are menopausal have similar levels of estrogen in their tissues as women who are in their follicular phase. So that pre-ovulatory phase, the highest time of our cycle where our estrogen is at its very highest to bring on ovulation, menopausal women's tissues oftentimes reflect that height of estrogen. So, especially within that first 4 years of menopause. Now, for some women, that can wane over time, but there's there's nuance there that's not being acknowledged. It's just like blood levels low, you must be low. And I've seen that actually be very harmful for a lot of women. I can't tell you how many women who are put on estrogen just immediately when they start to go through perimenopause and just gain so much weight. And nobody will acknowledge that it's the estrogen. Like everyone will say it might be your thyroid, it might be your this, it might be your that, but like it's not the estrogen, right? The estrogen is protecting their bones.
Right, right, right. I mean, from what Dr. Ray Pete was sharing about what you said with menopausal women having estrogen levels similar, the same to women, fertile women in their follicular phases. It seems like if one were to do hormone replacement therapy, the only thing that would make logical sense would be to use progesterone.
I think that's kind of the logical step would be to try that or to, if you're after like the youthfulness, if you're after the metabolic benefits, if you're after the things, because I don't understand why somebody would want to keep their hormones the same as a cycling woman when they're not, they're not trying to reproduce anymore. So there's just no point to it. But if you're trying to chase the youthfulness that hormones bring, well, progesterone is the thing that brings the youthfulness. Progesterone is the thing that brings that like that kind of feminizing pregnancy glow, like what we think of when a woman is pregnant, like, oh, you're glowing, it's like that is that progesterone that you're seeing. So yeah, it would definitely make sense. And like you said, it's so weird how there's so much estrogen being pushed right now. And then it's like, oh yeah, and then don't forget to take your progestin, and it's like, what is going on? It's kind of it's freaky.
Well, and in this podcast too, they spoke about menopause, and many people do, not just this podcast, but they spoke about menopause as though it were a disease.
Yes.
And I'm like, it's an inevitable rite of passage. A
Yeah.
biological rite of passage as a woman. It's not a disease, but they did
Yeah.
speak of it as one. I,
Yeah.
I, I'm, I guess I'm bringing this up because, there are more and more women are having babies later, and so they're having babies. We are having babies, and in this time when we're kind of between worlds, we're kind of exiting our mother, we're closer to the menopausal years and yet still wanting to be fertile. So it's
Mm.
an interesting thing going on for a lot of women because we are having babies later.
Yeah, that is a good point to bring up. And there is this kind of, I feel like our society is so obsessed with like maidenhood and motherhood. And so we want to stay as, as young as possible for as long as possible. There is that like that very weird, there's a weird layer to it.
Yeah, and I I have a mama who is amazing, and she's been worried about wrinkles for I don't know 30 years, and so that's kind of the messaging I've always received. And so a lot of part of my practice, especially as I can see that I'm aging, like is is seeing older women and seeing their beauty, like seeing how
Yes.
like appreciating that because I admittedly. I think for a while I would see I thought wrinkles were ugly and it's hard to age. I mean, it's hard because
Yes.
but it's like you literally have to retrain yourself as to like what you see as beautiful and all of this pro-metabolic stuff is so important because I realized like if it doesn't matter if you age, if you have energy, if you have like a spark, you will beautiful. Like if you are nourished and you have energy, that's really beautiful,
Yeah.
you
Yes,
know?
I agree. I agree. There is that weird transition where we're almost like it's ships passing in the night where our youth is waning a little bit. Like we really have to face our youth is no longer like we're no longer youthful, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're no longer valuable. And associating, I love what you said about like appreciating people's beauty because I love wrinkles. Like I love aging. I love aging. I think it's such a gift and I think it's also just like to me, I see signs of aging as synonymous with what have people been through? They've been through so much, they've learned so much. There's wisdom there. Those are signs of wisdom. Now, I don't think we always think of that in our culture and our society and that doesn't, some people don't necessarily gain wisdom with age, unfortunately. But I think if we can in our own lives kind of value it as a gaining of wisdom and there's its own beauty in that. It's not the beauty of youth, but it's the beauty of wisdom. I think you're right. Like as long as you still have that spark of light and that life and that energy, it's infectious. It's beautiful.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. Um, totally. So, okay, back to thyroid.
Yeah.
About medication and also about lab tests. A lot of women won't have access necessarily to a complete thyroid panel. Do
Yeah.
you think that TSH is TSH plus listening to your body and how you feel plus basal body temperature? Is that a complete picture enough? Is TSH worth it? I guess is the question.
I think it can be a helpful tool. Like it's always good to know where your TSH is. I think it's absolutely bananas that TSH is being used to diagnose thyroid conditions. It's not even a thyroid hormone, it's a pituitary hormone. So, to say like to take thyroid stimulating hormone, the hormone that stimulates the thyroid, and to say, okay, the stimulating hormone is high or low, therefore your thyroid function is poor, is a lot of like mental gymnastics. And there are other things that impact TSH, like our stress levels can impact TSH, nutrient deficiencies can impact TSH. So TSH itself, I don't think is enough. But like you said, if someone doesn't have access to a full thyroid panel, not that full thyroid panels always tell you the whole story. Blood tests are just a snapshot in time anyways. I think basal body thermometers and taking your basal body temperature is a very helpful tool. Same with your pulse rate, because you're able to measure these day-to-day temperatures over just one snapshot in time. So you're able to actually look at your body's patterns. The thing about Synthroid or these synthetic T4 based medications is that they still have to be converted. So that's why there's so many women that, you can actually see some of these studies where they'll compare Synthroid with natural desiccated thyroid. That in natural desiccated thyroid includes not just T4, but T3 and T2. Some of it's the whole thyroid gland. And so you'll see like they'll compare and then they'll survey the study participants, and they'll say, did you prefer Synthroid or do you prefer natural desiccated thyroid? And like usually the percentages are so high for people that prefer natural desiccated thyroid just because they actually see an improvement in their symptoms, whereas a lot of people who take Synthroid say like, maybe I feel a little better, but not that much better. And it's because if you have a conversion issue, you're still going to have a conversion issue with Synthroid or T4 based medications. Like it's not going to fix a conversion issue. It's going to add more T4 into the picture, but you still have to convert it into active T3, which can be difficult to do if the problems that we talked about are still there, stress-based problems or undernourishment. The liver needs to be fueled in order to convert.
Yeah, there's something to be said for like choosing more nutrient dense foods so that your micronutrient levels become more replete because so many processes are dependent on B vitamins or whatever, a certain mineral cofactor. I don't know. So there's something to be said for, I know we talked about eating more, but also like eating more nutrient dense foods, which we talk about a lot on the channel tend to be animal products, you
Right.
know?
Right. Yeah, being aware of digestibility too, like how can your body actually break this down and assimilate it? If it's a plant food, then just make sure you're preparing it for digestibility. It's not necessarily bad. I think if we all just really study like our very traditional diets and like how those foods were cooked, I think we would be very surprised at how much better we would feel. Like most things were eaten for digestibility.
Right. And most plant foods were cooked. I mean, that's
Yep.
just how it is. That's just
Yep.
how it um
Cooked, pickled, tossed in some type of acid.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Some sort of transformation some sort of transformation, especially for, the green leafy vegetables and all that stuff. Like in the South, I'm from the South, and people eat collard greens, but you cook them for a couple of hours with a ham hock, like
Exactly.
pork. I
Yeah.
know, that's the thing. It's not all that complicated. It's not all that super complicated. But it can be, I get that. Like if I had met you when you were going through all those things, like all the autoimmune issues and PCOS and all this stuff you named at the beginning, and I said, Jessica, it's really just not that complicated.
Yes. I would have been like, okay.
Unhelpful. So
Yeah.
so that's why I understand like this process. And I was even just because I took some notes, I was thinking about your PCOS diagnosis. I mean, do you think that being lower carb, because a lot of people talk about, okay, that has to do with too many carbs, too much insulin, it's a blood sugar issue. I mean, do you think that PCOS, someone who's got that, always needs to go through that lower carb, lower insulin pathway, or they could go straight to the pro-metabolic space? Again, I know it's like each case is different, but you know what I mean? Because traditionally, we're going lower sugar with that.
Yeah, I think that if I would have not gone the lower carb route, I probably would have regained insulin sensitivity much faster. Because there are some, like I feel like in a way I made myself a little bit more insulin resistant by only going low carb, and sure it catered to the issues, but it didn't necessarily make all the symptoms go away. And it was for me, it was like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm ovulating again, but now my testosterone has tanked, or now my adrenal hormones are high. Oh, now my thyroid's poor. So I think PCOS has a lot to do with thyroid function, to be honest, and adrenal function. And that's why, you'll sometimes hear like the four types of PCOS, where there's like inflammatory PCOS and insulin resistant PCOS and adrenal PCOS and lean PCOS. And really, I think that it's kind of, you have to look at, are your symptoms being adrenal driven? Like, are you a high stress individual, high cortisol, high DHEA? Or are you someone that can't manage your blood sugar? Like your blood sugar is just, you're truly resistant to insulin. You're not using fuel well. But I don't necessarily think that like just cutting all carbs is the answer. Sure, blood sugar regulation is the answer, and everyone's kind of coming from a different place. I think the digestive tract can make a big difference. I know for me, gut issues were definitely at the root of a lot of my problems, but my gut issues are very mostly driven by stress. So like cortisol, adrenaline, no matter how many, digestive protocols I did, or gut tests or anything like that, that didn't really fix it, but regulating my um nervous system and eating well changed my digestion completely. So I don't think it's as cut and dry as just like go lower carb, or just like cut out all carbs. I think there's definitely nuance there for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, Absolutely. Well, listen, we've gone over time and I want to be respectful of your time. You are such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just so grateful for your work and for how many women you're helping with all of your work. You've certainly helped me, and I think you've inspired a lot of women, and you are an icon in the women's
Thank you.
health space, and just totally grateful for your message of nourishment for women, because we deserve to be nourished and
Yeah.
thriving.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the time to reawaken the mother, right? Reawaken the woman, renourish her.
Yeah, and what a gift it is to our lineage. Like what a gift it is to all the women who will come after us. Like what a gift it is to kind of say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We totally appreciate all the women who helped us become who we are, and like maybe we are going to nourish ourselves in a way that like means that the future women in our lives will have this knowledge sooner.
Yep. Yep. I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah. What an honor to be a part of that.
Yes, it's so amazing. And I'm going to share all of your links to Instagram and your website. I know you have a course. You still have that course, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's being revamped right now, so if you can't get access to it, it will be available soon.
Okay, awesome. I will point people to those links. Hey, if you ever are like thinking, you want to translate that into Spanish, I could
Ooh,
I could definitely help market that because I think that there would
okay.
be a lot of interest for sure. But I'm going to
Okay.
point people to your links and thank you. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Katie.
Okay, bye, Jessica.
Bye.